In an interview with the German newspaper BR, a Ukrainian soldier deployed on the eastern battlefield warns that 5 brigades of his army in the city of Minoat in the east of the country are nearly encircled while Russian troops continue advancing near Pokrovsk. According to his statements, Russian units have cut all supply routes so that around 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers are stuck in Minoat. The soldier describes the situation as extremely critical and explains that his group can now only be reached with ammunition and supplies via unmanned aerial vehicles. At the same time, he reports that Russian forces have taken control of nearly all buildings between Minoat and the parts of the Donbass still controlled by Ukraine. Before a meeting of NATO ministers, a senior alliance representative declared that Minoat is now considered nearly completely encircled and that Russia controls more than 95% of the city of Pokrovsk. There is only a narrow corridor through which Ukrainian troops could withdraw some forces, but it lies entirely within the Russian line of fire, making it practically unusable. The NATO representative also emphasized that the Ukrainian units deployed in Minoat have not laid down their weapons and continue repelling Russian attacks in the urban area. He added that Ukraine is already preparing further defensive lines in case Pokrovsk and Minoat fall and Russia continues its advance in the region. Thus, for the roughly 1,000 soldiers encircled at the front line, the question arises whether they can be led out of the tightening ring in time or whether Russia will cut off the retreat for good. Welcome to our channel where we classify the military situation in Ukraine and its consequences for international security step by step. The nearly complete encirclement of 5 Ukrainian brigades in Minoat is occurring at a time when the front in the Donbass is noticeably shifting and both sides are fighting at high speed for key positions. Particularly the development in Pokrovsk, where Russian forces are said by NATO to already control more than 95% of the urban areas, significantly changes the balance of power on the Eastern Front. At the same time, Ukraine is trying to build new defensive lines and secure additional supply routes in order to support the units in Minoat that are under heavy pressure. The reports of the anonymous frontline soldier who speaks of cut supply routes and dependence on unmanned aerial vehicles for supplies illustrate how fragile the situation in the pocket has become. Against this background, the question of whether the narrow withdrawal corridor can be kept open under Russian fire takes on central importance for the further course of the fighting. Will Kyiv succeed in stabilizing its encircled troops, or does a possible collapse of the position in Minoat mark a turning point in the struggle for the Donbass? According to the Ukrainian soldier cited in the BR report, the critical situation in Minoat began when Russian formations cut the last supply routes and the roughly 1,000 soldiers stationed there were completely cut off from their rear structures. The soldier described that his unit can now only be reached with ammunition, food, and medical material via unmanned aerial vehicles, and that even these flights have become increasingly dangerous. He emphasized that Russian forces have brought nearly every building between Minoat and the parts of the Donbass still held by Ukraine under their control, which makes a land corridor for supplies de facto impossible. At the same time, a high-ranking NATO representative reported before the ministerial meeting that Russia holds more than 95% of the urban structures in Pokrovsk and that Minoat is therefore classified as nearly completely encircled. According to his statements, only an extremely narrow corridor exists through which individual Ukrainian groups could theoretically be withdrawn, but it lies completely within the Russian line of fire. The official made clear that the Ukrainian units in Minoat are nevertheless continuing to fight repelling attacks and attempting to hold the inner-city defensive lines. In parallel, NATO declared that Ukraine is preparing additional defensive positions in case both Pokrovsk and Minoat should fall, and Russia could then advance into further sections of the front. The Operational Command of the East reported that additional supply routes are being established to provide units in Pokrovsk and Minoat with supplies, although the situation remains tense due to Russian attacks in both cities. The report also mentioned that President Vladimir Putin stated at the beginning of the week that Kyiv is trying at any cost to relieve the encircled forces by deploying newly formed units into the area. The region around the BRS Minohoras metropolitan area has for months been considered one of the most intense hotspots of the conflict since several smaller localities are strategically interconnected there. The current development in Minoat and Pokrovsk can only be understood against the background of the months-long fighting in the eastern Donbass, where Russian troops have gradually attempted to bring strategic towns and connecting routes under their control. Since the beginning of the year, both sides have strengthened their presence in the BRS Minohoras metropolitan area because several smaller localities there create a direct operational connection between sections of the front. For Russia, the takeover of these urban hubs means possible access to Ukrainian defensive lines located further to the south and west, and it opens additional axes for future offensives. Ukraine, in turn, has attempted to hold its positions in this area because the loss of Minoat or Pokrovsk would weaken the entire structure of the Ukrainian defense in the Donbass. The now reported cut of supply routes is reminiscent of earlier phases of the conflict in which similar tactics were used to isolate Ukrainian units and gradually deprive them of logistical capability. The soldier cited in the BR report indicated that his unit has been confronted with increasing difficulties in resupply for weeks because Russian forces have moved closer and closer to the remaining routes. The NATO representative's statement, according to which only a narrow corridor remains, confirms that the tactical situation for Ukraine in the Donbass has dramatically worsened and that the area of Minoat is now considered a potential focal point of a larger encirclement. Historically, the Donbass has repeatedly been the scene of intense fighting, in which control over individual district streets and industrial facilities was decisive for the course of entire sections of the front. The current phase also shows parallels to earlier stages of the war as both sides attempt to secure operational control over supply axes and communication lines through territorial gains. The note from the Ukrainian Eastern Command that additional supply routes are to be created shows that Kyiv is trying to prevent a complete cutoff of forces in Minoat, although Russian attacks are occurring simultaneously in several areas. Putin's statement that Kyiv is trying at any cost to deploy newly formed units indicates that Russia is closely observing Ukrainian movements in this area and may take further measures to intercept reinforcements. The Eastern Command of Ukraine speaks of establishing additional supply routes, which means that structural measures such as rerouting transport using smaller convoys or utilizing nighttime windows may become necessary. Parallel to the events in Minoat and Pokrovsk, the report refers to Ukraine's increased security efforts throughout the Donbass, as there is a danger that Russian troops may target further sections of the front after possible territorial gains. The latest statements from NATO reflect the assessment that Ukraine is under significant pressure to stabilize its defensive lines while simultaneously maintaining operational reserves. Against this background, not only the course of fighting within the cities, but also the ability to bridge logistical bottlenecks and keep tactical withdrawal options open will determine the further dynamics of the conflict. The recent statements of a high-ranking NATO representative illustrate how closely the alliance is following the situation in Minoat and Pokrovsk. The official emphasized that the Ukrainian units, despite the nearly closed encirclement, continue to offer resistance and repel Russian attacks inside the city, even though the supply situation is becoming increasingly precarious. This assessment underscores that NATO evaluates the situation not only militarily, but also politically, since a possible collapse of Ukrainian positions could have significant consequences for the stability of the entire region. In parallel, Ukrainian authorities reported that new defensive positions are being prepared to intercept a possible Russian breakthrough and to limit the consequences for other sections of the front. President Vladimir Putin stated at the beginning of the week that Kyiv is trying at any cost to relieve the encircled units in Minoat by deploying newly formed troops into the area, a statement that shows Moscow is closely observing Ukrainian movements. At the international level, there were also reports about Ukraine's diplomatic efforts to obtain security guarantees from Western states, even if these are not directly connected to the situation in Minoat. It was mentioned, for example, that Finland's prime minister declared his country is currently not prepared to provide security guarantees modeled on NATO, but remains ready to support Ukraine through other security policy mechanisms. At the same time, the Swedish head of government made clear that Europe should focus on strengthening Ukraine's military capability in the long term, as this represents the most reliable form of security. On the economic level, reports highlighted the Ukrainian budget for 2026, which foresees a massive increase in expenditures for defense and security, an indication of how much the state classifies the military situation as a strategic priority. Meanwhile, the European Central Bank stated that certain financing models for Ukraine aid are being examined but not implemented as they could affect existing European treaties. Taken together, these international reactions show that developments on the front are not viewed in isolation, but have far-reaching diplomatic, economic, and security policy dimensions that extend beyond the immediate conflict zone. Given the nearly closed encirclement in Minoat, Ukraine faces several possible scenarios that could each have significant effects on the further course of the fighting in the Donbass. If the Ukrainian armed forces succeed in keeping the narrow withdrawal corridor open, despite heavy Russian fire, individual units could be led out of the city and thus saved from a complete collapse. However, such a scenario would require reinforcements to arrive in time and Russian troops not to move further toward the remaining access routes. If, on the other hand, the Russian encirclement continues to close and Ukraine cannot support its encircled forces in time, the loss of the position in Minoat threatens with far-reaching consequences for the surrounding sections of the front. In such a case, Russian units could, after securing territory, attempt to expand their operations toward further strategic towns and place additional Ukrainian lines under pressure. A third scenario is that the fighting over Minoat enters a longer phase in which both sides attempt to secure operational control over supply routes and defensive axes through limited territorial gains. In such a stalemate, the supply situation of the Ukrainian units could become the decisive factor, especially because dependence on UAV deliveries is already reaching its limits. Putin's comment that Kyiv is trying at any cost to deploy new units indicates that Russia expects additional Ukrainian countermeasures and is preparing possible interception efforts accordingly. NATO's assessments, according to which Ukraine must simultaneously keep withdrawal options open and prepare new defensive positions, show that the situation in this section of the front remains extremely dynamic. Finally, the question remains whether international support, particularly in the areas of security, economy, and military equipment, will be sufficient to stabilize Ukraine during a phase of increasing strain. Thus, further developments will depend not only on the immediate combat situation in Minoat, but also on how quickly and effectively Ukraine can bridge its logistical bottlenecks and adjust its defensive lines. The developments in Minoat and Pokrovsk clearly show how fragile the situation on the Eastern Front has become, and how strongly Ukraine is under pressure from the nearly closed encirclement. The statements of the anonymous soldier, the assessment of the NATO representative, and the reports of the Ukrainian Eastern Command make clear that the supply situation and the control over the remaining withdrawal routes will be decisive in the coming days. At the same time, Putin's remark about Ukraine's attempts to relieve its forces indicates that Russia is closely monitoring every step Kyiv takes and is preparing possible countermeasures. Thus, it remains open whether Ukraine will succeed in stabilizing its encircled units or whether the further closing ring in Minoat will become a turning point in the fighting in the Donbass. The upcoming decisions of both sides on the battlefield, as well as in the logistical and diplomatic spheres, will determine how the balance of power in the East will continue to develop. We will continue to closely observe the situation and report on every relevant development. If you do not want to miss any of our analyses, subscribe to our channel, leave a rating, and share this video to support our work.